Robin is Professor of English at King's College in Pennsylvania. She earned her PhD from the University of Virginia and her BA from Cornell University. She teaches contemporary women's literature, multi-ethnic American literature and writing courses. Her book, Writing the Survivor, the written novel in late 20th century American fiction, which is, I would really recommend you read it. I think one of our presenters quoted from it earlier. It was published by Clemson University Press in 2020. She's co-editor of 3 edited collections, #MeToo and Modernism, which will be forthcoming in 2023, Critical Perspectives on Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, Feminism and Diaspora from 2022, and Transforming Diaspora Communities Beyond National Boundaries in 2011. She's published essays on Jhumpa Lahiri, and sorry if my pronunciation is very far from good, Sandra Cisneros, Alice Walker, Jana Monji, Ayad Akhtar, Lynn Sharon Schwartz, and other contemporary writers. She's managing editor of the journal South Asian Review and associate editor of the journal Zeal, a journal for the liberal arts. So thanks very much, Robin. We are really looking forward to hearing from you. So Robin's going to speak, I think probably for about half an hour, and then we're going to take questions. So yeah, as you're listening, maybe also be starting to think about things you might want to take chance to ask Robin about. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much for this invitation to speak today with you at this important conference, A World Without Violence Against Women and Girls. I'm grateful to Hilary McCollum, who issued the invitation for me to share my work with the community of Queen's University Belfast, and to others joining us from around the country and around the globe to listen and discuss how to end gender violence. Next slide. My talk comes from my 2020 book entitled Writing the Survivor, the rape novel in late 20th century American fiction. While it's a book of literary and cultural criticism, Writing the Survivor was always meant to be read by anyone interested in how the stories of rape and sexual violence are told and where these stories come from. In my book, I discuss the origins of a new genre of fiction that I call the rape novel. And I argue that these novels do activist work and educate readers with the end goal of ending rape. While my book is limited to fiction by American writers, its ideas cross national boundaries, even as the literary and cultural histories it examines are specific to the United States. Importantly, I see the rape novel emerging from the intersection of feminist activism and literary criticism. These ideas appeared in today's presentations and certainly will be discussed tomorrow in those conference sessions as well. I'd like to begin by discussing how American fiction published before 1970 did not portray rape as sexual violence, but instead as titillating and pornographic voyeurism. Margaret Mitchell's 1936 novel, Gone with the Wind, offers perhaps the most well-known depiction of unrecognized marital rape in the early 20th century American culture. This rape vanishes from the novel and the 1939 film, and from much of American cultural memory of Gone with the Wind, to be replaced by more prevalent cultural constructions of rape and sexual violence that permeated American sensibilities until the early 1970s. Next slide. Let us recall the infamous staircase scene. This occurs both in the novel and in the film. The images are taken from the film. The first image shows Rhett and Scarlett arguing, and Rhett physically manhandling Scarlett until she walks away from him. Rhett then follows her, scoops her up in his arms, and carries her upstairs to have sex with her, all while she is struggling and beating him with her fists. This scene utilizes a plethora of myths that obfuscate the pain and terror of rape. Scarlett likes being overpowered by Rhett, the myth that all women secretly crave rape. Although she resists at first, ultimately Scarlett enjoys herself. The myth, if you're going to be raped, you may as well enjoy it. Rhett was overcome with passion for his wife. Men cannot control their biological urge to have sex. And Scarlett is not raped because Rhett is her husband. A husband cannot rape his wife. The prominence of Gone with the Wind as a cultural artifact helped to inscribe an understanding of rape in the American psyche that was stripped of pain, fear, and degradation for the woman involved. In this scene, rape was simply rough sex, and rough sex was, in turn, posed as the height of eroticism, as we can see from the last image, where Scarlett awakens the next morning, thoroughly pleased with the previous night's experience. These understandings of rape appear throughout American literature in the mid-20th century, from Ralph Ellison's novel Invisible Man in 1952 to Norman Mailer's An American Dream in 1965. Mailer, for example, presents as normative the view that all women enjoy pain, degradation, and humiliation. As his novels were touted for their sexual freedom, their graphic representations of forced, violent sex presume and encourage voyeuristic enjoyment on the part of readers. In her 1970 volume, Sexual Politics, Kate Millay convincingly describes how Mailer instead promotes a repressive gender politics. Because of its efficacy in functioning as a trope for contested social and cultural agendas, rape becomes sundered from its original signification of violation of a human body. Just as Sexual Politics was published in 1970, a new genre of American fiction also arose in 1970 to combat these twisted notions of rape and sexual violence. I call this new genre the rape novel. The rape novel arose in the wake of the women's liberation movement with the dual mandates of feminist activism and the literary recuperation of female experiences. Critics such as Sabine Silke and Pamela Barnett have argued convincingly that representations of rape in earlier American fiction foremost signify concerns about race, class, and nationality. Building upon this work, I demonstrate how African American, Asian American, Latinx, Native American, and Anglo-American women in the 1970s and early 80s collectively challenged the traditional troping of sexual violence that erased female subjectivity and agency. The rape novel not only foregrounds the victim and her story in a textual centering, which restores her dignity and self-worth, but it also develops new narratological strategies for portraying violent, disturbing subject matter in a constructive and informative manner. In bringing together many of the key texts of the last decade of the 20th century, the rape novel demonstrates the centrality of sexual assault to women's fiction of this era. Ultimately, Writing the Survivor offers a radical reconsideration of the late 20th century American novel. First, by underscoring the importance of women's activism upon its form and content, and secondly, by offering the rape novel as evidence for the critical necessity of reading across ethnic literary traditions. Let's examine a key text that inspired the rape novel, which came from not only American literature, but also the second wave feminists working in the anti-rape movement in America. Next slide, please. A key rhetorical strategy used by the anti-rape activists to combat rape myths was a speech of victim survivors. Survivor testimony provides persuasive evidence about the traumatic effects of rape and other sexual violence upon its victims. As Charlotte Pierce Baker, a rape survivor, writes in Surviving the Silence, Black Women's Stories of Rape, quote, "The way out is to tell. Speak the acts perpetrated upon us. Speak the atrocities. Speak the injustices. Speak the personal violations of the soul. Someone will listen. Someone will believe our stories. Someone will join us." Next slide. Despite the progress made in changing attitudes about rape, the stigma of shame still existed for the survivor of sexual assault in the mid-1970s. Although she may be willing to tell her story, the rape survivor did not often want to connect her real identity to that story. However, a few women already familiar to the greater public did write about their experiences with sexual assault. I will focus on the revelation of singer Billie Holiday, which are significant in their brutal honesty about the trauma of sexual assault. Billie Holiday's memoir, Lady Sings the Blues, was published in 1956, 3 years before her death. Lady Sings the Blues details the chanteuse's brief, hard life, which included a traumatic childhood rape. The incident of sexual violence in the memoir is genuine, even if the wording of the episode may not be exactly Holiday's own, given the use of a ghostwriter for the book. Holiday attests she was just 10 years old when she was raped by a neighbor, Mr. Dick. The man lured her into a nearby house by telling her that Sadie, her mother, had asked him to take her there. When young Billie went to take a nap, Mr. Dick raped her. In the meantime, Sadie learned where Mr. Dick had taken Billie, and she and a police officer broke into the house and ended the assault. However, according to Holiday, the rape was just the first iniquity of that day. The police officer took both Mr. Dick and Billie to the police station, and Billie was put into a cell. After several days in jail, she was taken to court, where she was sentenced to serve time in a Catholic institution until the age of 21. Only after Holiday's mother and grandfather hired a lawyer was Billie released. Holiday's description of her rape are deeply compelling, offering both an emotional connection to readers and information previously unavailable about sexual assault. Notably, Holiday relates her traumatic experiences with a vulnerability that greatly contrasts with the brash tone seen in most of the memoir. This emotion compels readers to sympathize with her and listen carefully to the details of her story. These details, in turn, demonstrate the inherent horror of sexual assault, a viewpoint not seen at the time of the book's publication. Holiday says in the middle of the description of the rape, "I'll never forget that night. Even if you're a whore, you don't want to be raped. It's the worst thing that can happen to a woman. And here it was happening to me when I was 10. Next slide. Holiday demonstrates that rape has long-term ramifications upon the survivor, and crucially, that a woman's sexual history is immaterial. That she was a child makes this already terrible crime even more horrific. Holiday reaffirms her opinions later in the book, saying, "Things had happened to me that no time could ever change or heal. I had gone to jail when I was 10 because a 40-year-old man had tried to rape me. For years, I dreamed about it and wake up hollering and screaming. My God, it's terrible what something like this does to you. It takes years and years to get over it. It haunts you and haunts you. For years, it made me feel like a damn cripple. It changed the way I looked at everything and everybody. There was one chance I couldn't take. I couldn't stand any man who didn't know about the things that had happened to me when I was a kid. And I was leery of any man who could throw those things back at me in a quarrel. I could take almost anything, but my God, not that. I didn't want anyone around who might have ever hold this over me or even hint that on account of it, he was a cut above me." Holiday returns to her childhood rape even in the middle of her life story. Such behavior is indicative of what Judith Herman describes as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This quotation occurs in the middle of her description of her marriage in 1941, which in turn demonstrates the relevance of her rape to her later emotional and sexual life. Her words underscore the importance of the reaction of one's community, especially family and close friends. As Herman writes, quote, "A supportive response from other people may mitigate the impact of the event, while a hostile or negative response may compound the damage and aggravate the traumatic syndrome." According to the memoir, only one person reacts supportively to Holiday's rape, her mother, Sadie, who is the only person to provide consolation to her daughter after the assault. The rest of the community blames young Billie for the attack against her. The end of that long quotation also demonstrates the negative reaction that occurs years after the rape. When Holiday told lovers about her traumatic past, some of these men evidently shunned her for being a rape survivor. Yet Holiday's portrayal of these harmful reactions also demonstrates her resistance against those people who blame the victim for being raped, for she refuses to associate with men who vilify her. Holliday's tone demystifies the experience of sexual assault for the reader. Instead of being shrouded in mystery, rape is presented honestly and openly. Holliday acknowledges that rape is a traumatic experience from which it takes years to recover, as her own experience demonstrates. Her colloquial language, "My God, it's terrible what something like this does to you," establishes the intimacy with readers seen later in literature. Holliday also reveals how the victim was routinely blamed for the violence that she endured. Yet she asserts in 1956 what was revolutionary to anti-rape activists in the 1970s. A woman should have complete autonomy over her body and her sexual decisions, no matter her reputation or previous sexual experiences. She exposes the hypocrisy of the judicial system in blaming the victim for the crime committed against her, and she resists the notion that being raped makes her less worthy of respect and love. Holliday's emotionally charged story of childhood rape and its after effects underscores the absurdity of blaming a child or any victim for being raped. Yet perhaps the most significant contribution of Billie Holiday to our understanding of rape in the 20th century is the attachment of her name to her story. Here was a woman in the public eye who was not afraid to identify herself as a rape survivor. While by the mid-1970s, rape survivors were encouraged to share their stories in order to aid their healing processes, anonymity was always the available and most often pre-selected condition for the story. Holliday's choice to relate her experiences openly assisted in dismantling the automatic association of shame with rape, and demonstrated that any woman, even a famous jazz singer, could be the victim of this crime. It also demonstrates that life goes on after rape, for Holliday became one of the most celebrated jazz singers of the 20th century. Her artistic brilliance is her permanent legacy within American cultural history. Her brave revelation of her childhood rape is a significant turning point in American literary history. So the first rape novels written in the 70s struggled with the literary legacy of the rape trope and societal acceptance of rape myths. These texts acknowledge that rape may indeed signify issues of race, class, or nationality. However, importantly, they also demand that rape be understood as the violation of a woman's person. These novels portrayed rape as rape, allowing the reader to understand the violence enacted upon the victim's body, the brutality impressed upon her mind, and the devastating personal and communal repercussions of the act. This recentering is achieved through the unflinchingly realistic portrayal of sexual violence on the page. The central prerogative of rape fiction in the 1980s is to underscore the legitimacy of the traumatic experience by providing in-depth accounts of the assault and its physical and psychological repercussions. Novels such as Alice Walker's The Color Purple, Sandra Cisneros's The House on Mango Street, and Bharti Mukherjee's Jasmine all contain harrowing scenes that use their detail in order to emphasize the fact that rape engenders deep psychological consequences. Far from glamorizing sexual violence, these novels present an alternative narrative focus that educates the uninformed reader and provides affirmation to those survivors seeking an empathetic community. So let's go to the next slide and look at Mukherjee's novel Jasmine as an example of a 1980s rape novel that educates readers about what rape is and centers the victim survivor. Mukherjee replaces the point of view of the perpetrator, which was the go-to narrative focus before 1970, with the first-person perspective of the anguished rape victim and refers to the assault as rape. Mukherjee's protagonist has multiple identities in the novel, so I call her J in order not to highlight any particular one identity. So after Jay loses her husband Prakash to a terrorist bomb, she leaves India to commit sati at the college in Florida where Prakash was meant to study. Using falsified documents, she travels to Europe and meets Half-Face, the captain of a boat that carries her to the United States. Once in Florida, Half-Face offers her a ride to the nearby hotel where he works and lives. He denies responsibility for the rape before it begins, his words signaling his intention to have sex with her, regardless of her wishes. Unlocking the door to the motel room, he says, "Note, you're entering because you want to. No coercion involved." Inside the motel room, Jay does not respond to Half-Face's caresses and instead tells him about Prakash, eventually begging, "Please don't do anything to me." Half-Face's response is to smash her head against the television until the screen cracks, pull off her clothes, and violently rape her. Afterward, Jay walks to the bathroom, and Half-Face calls after her, "Don't take all night. Second time's the sweetest." In the bathroom, faced with the inevitability of another rape, Jay pulls out the small knife she has and considers killing herself. Instead, she slices her tongue to drip blood from her mouth, assuming the role of Kali, the Hindu goddess of destruction. Returning to the bedroom, Jay slits the throat of the dozing Half-Face and then stabs him to death. She leaves the motel after burning her suitcase, no longer intending to commit sati. Instead, she sheds her previous identity to create a new life in America. In subsequent chapters, Mukherjee refers to Jay's experience specifically as rape, and Jay herself spends significant emotional energy trying to put the violent experience behind her. The details of Jay's assault educates readers about rape and the traumatic repercussions that haunt victim survivors for years after. Foremost, Mukherjee dispels the rape myth that a woman should have foreseen her assault or could have prevented its occurrence. Jay's traumatic experience, in fact, begins before she enters the motel room with Half-Face, which explains why she could not stop the events, either physically by leaving the motel or verbally by insisting she did not want to have sex. Specifically, Jay suffers from several symptoms of post-traumatic stress that prevent her from successfully protecting herself. Next slide, please. As Judith Herman explains, traumatic events generally involve threats to life or bodily injury, or a close personal encounter with violence and death. These include being taken by surprise, trapped, or exposed to the point of exhaustion. In each instance, the salient characteristic of the traumatic event is its power to inspire helplessness and terror. Jay experiences traumatic violence even before Half-Face rapes her. First, she survives the bombing that killed her husband. She's also vulnerable to Half-Face's attack because of the unnarrated rapes she suffers on her journey from India to America. These rapes occur when she is both trapped and exposed to the point of exhaustion as she travels on planes, bribes custom guards, and improvises the next steps in her route alongside other underground travelers. Jay grimly endures these traumas by turning to the idea of fate, thinking what was fated to happen would happen. Fate and survival become intertwined. In order to live, she must be raped. In connecting sexual violence and survival, Mukherjee underscores the place of rape in the lives of disempowered women, especially those migratory women with little control over their circumstances. Next slide. When Jay enters the motel room with Half-Face, she is unable to resist the impending attack physically or verbally. Her helplessness is reinforced by the violence Half-Face inflicts upon her even before the rape itself begins. The smashing of her head against the television screen, etc. Here, Jay experiences a symptom of trauma called constriction or numbing. When a person is completely powerless, says Judith Herman, and any form of resistance is futile, she may go into a state of surrender. The system of self-defense shuts down entirely. The helpless person escapes from her situation, not by action in the real world, but rather by altering her state of consciousness. Half-Face drops Jay on the bed after slamming her head into the television, but then pauses to paw through her suitcase. As she's entered this state of surrender, she does not try to fight or escape at this point, instead numbly awaiting further violence. Her last attempt at verbal resistance comes as Half-Face is undoing the drawstring of her pants. She says, "Please don't do anything to me." But Half-Face undresses himself and her, and Jay narrates the rape as follows. "He stared. His hands were trembling, and then he whooped, 'Oh God,' and tried to kiss me, but he was all hands and face in motion. I twisted, only delaying the inevitable, perhaps making it worse, more forced, more violent. I tried to keep my eyes on Ganpati and prayed for the strength to survive, long enough to kill myself. Yet afterward, in the shower, when she thinks of suicide, she no longer feels numb into surrendering to the violence. Instead, she experiences the traumatic symptom of reenactment, where trauma survivors repeat the traumatic situation, sometimes unconsciously, but other times with the hope of changing the outcome of the dangerous encounter. Since she has been raped many times and is about to be raped again, she has these unresolved feelings of terror and rage. So she's inspired to slice her tongue, re-enter the bedroom, and murder Half-Face. She rewrites the outcome of this specific trauma by killing her attacker. Yet she also rejects the self who has lived through the trauma by destroying the vestiges of her old life. She had planned to take her husband's suit to the engineering school and to burn it and herself. But instead, she burns the suitcase and walks away from the motel room. So let me move forward as I'm looking at the time here, and go ahead and talk about a novel from the early 20th century. So let's move on to the next slide to look at how novels use fragmentary narration linked to the experience and memory of a sexual assault in order to represent the varying portrayals of rape and sexual violence seen in contemporary society, which counters those who dismiss charges of sexual abuse as exaggerated or untrue. So at the end of my book, I talk about male rape novels of the 21st century, which expands the communal understanding of rape by uncoupling gender from the victims and the perpetrators. So I'll first talk about Sapphire's novel, The Kid. The Kid has the protagonist, Abdul Jones, who is the son of Precious Jones, the heroine of Sapphire's more famous novel, Push, from 1996. In this sequel, Precious dies when Abdul is 9 years old, and he's placed into foster care, where he is violently beaten and raped by another child. Once released from the hospital, he lives at St. Elantha's School for Boys. Here again, Abdul is raped by brother John, who claims to express his love for the boy through sex, and by brother Samuel, who dons a leather mask and punishes any misbehavior with rape. In book 2, which Abdul narrates as a 13-year-old, Abdul becomes a rapist himself as he sexually assaults his friend Jaime, whom he claims to love, and 5-year-old Richie, whom he says wants it as well. The Kid asks readers to maintain sympathy and empathy for Abdul as both victim and perpetrator of sexual violence, a challenge that some readers may find difficult because of the novel's explicit portrayal of child rape. Sapphire depicts Abdul as unaware he is a perpetrator, although his narration demonstrates his friend's lack of consent. Jaime clutches the blanket around him when Abdul appears at his bedside to pull it down. He cries out when Abdul sodomizes him and sobs when Abdul demands fellatio. Yet Abdul interprets Jaime's response differently, saying, "He's shivering with excitement. He squeal. I slam my face in the pillow. Kill that." When Abdul returns to his bed, he notes his own fearfulness. "Why I'm so stink panicked, I don't know. Ain't nobody gonna hear that stupid little motherfucker. Shit, nobody heard me. Huh? What happened? Are you crazy, motherfucker? Nothing happened." Abdul's interior monologue demonstrates how he holds simultaneous realities to be true. Jaime wants to have sex with him. Jaime's crying will alert the adults that Abdul is hurting him. No one cares whether the boys are having consensual or non-consensual sex. Abdul's note that nobody heard him leads us to wonder what there was to hear. His crying as he's raped? His moans as he has sex? Both? Abdul truly believes that nothing happened, that he did not rape Jaime, just as his reality of being raped by the brothers and possibly other boys is never acknowledged. Abdul himself suppresses any admission of himself as a perpetrator. Next slide. Abdul perhaps learns this strategy of denial when Brother John talks to him about Jaime. Brother John assures Abdul that Jaime's rape accusation is an attention-seeking lie. Indeed, his vehemence about what happened, it's all an MFing lie, I know that, prioritizes his own interpretation. He then warns Abdul, be careful. It's so easy for a little, I don't know, a little kindness, a little love to be taken the wrong way. By raping Abdul, Brother John says, give me some love, as an order for fellatio to the boy. Brother John offers a model for Abdul to understand his own assaults upon Jaime, and later the 5-year-old Richie. Brother John demonstrates how to ignore consent to focus upon sexual pleasure, i.e. love, allowing Abdul to think to himself, I ain't did nothing to that stupid kid. Nothing, in this case, means nothing bad or nothing wrong, as in how Brother John frames his own sexual abuse of Abdul. Indeed, calling male rape nothing denies its very existence, just as Abdul similarly imagines his abusive actions as a dream. When he leaves his bed in the night to rape Richie, he thinks, maybe I'm in my dreams. Maybe this is not real. It's a dream. These versions exist simultaneously for Abdul. He does nothing wrong. He has consensual sex with Jaime and Richie. He does something, that's the opposite of nothing, wrong to Jaime and Richie. Or he himself is raped by the boys and the brothers. Before Abdul leaves St. Elanthes, he thinks, I know I'm a good boy. Ask Brother John. Just as Brother John knows that Jaime's accusation is a lie, Abdul knows he's a good person. That is, if he asserts it, it must be true. Reality for Abdul is what he knows rather than an objective truth. Such a disconnection from reality underscores the trauma Abdul experiences, while also allowing him to perpetrate abuse upon others without acknowledging his actions as violent. Next slide, please. Is it possible to feel sympathy for Abdul? The rape novel as a genre asks readers to sympathize with the physical and emotional trauma suffered by rape victim survivors. Readers struggling with the graphic depictions of pain and violence in Book 1 are doubly challenged to witness Abdul's crimes against other boys, let alone to maintain empathy for his suffering throughout another 300 pages, even though he continues to be assaulted by trusted adults. The kid forces readers to confront the difficult reality lived by some survivors of sexual violence, asking whether they deserve sympathy and compassion when they inflict pain upon others. Psychologist Judith Herman argues that it is morally impossible to remain neutral in this conflict between victim and perpetrator. The bystander is forced to take sides. This position, us as readers, is deeply complicated when the victim and perpetrator are one and the same. In The Kid, Sapphire underscores how male rape victims may become sexual offenders themselves, a cycle of violence that compounds the initial tragedy and complicates the community's reaction to these victims. Next slide. In Sapphire's novel, the intersections of race, class, and religion allowed the perpetrators to maintain their power over these impoverished boys through their protected status as Catholic priests and brothers. In the final novel I'll discuss, John Boyne's A History of Loneliness, and here I apply my argument about the rape novel beyond American fiction. I argue that Boyne demands readerly introspection about the ramification of silence and inaction by depicting a victim of rape who becomes an enabler. In Boyne's novel, Catholic priest Odrin Yates narrates his molestation at 16 by his parish priest and his own entry to the priesthood the following year. Father Yates narrates this abuse obliquely in a long, confused sentence, including the words from the priest, "Wasn't it all a bit of fun and nothing to worry about?" The teenager then buries this memory of sexual abuse. "I moved some things to one part of my mind and other things to another, where they stayed for many years to come." Over his decades as a priest, Father Yates has the opportunity to stop fellow priests from abusing boys. His best friend, Father Tom Cardle, sexually assaults dozens of boys, including Father Yates' own nephew, Aidan, as the church simply transfers him to new parishes when charges surface. Ironically, Father Cardle calls out Father Yates for his silence and complicity, as Father Yates preferred to ignore his friend's abuse of children. In the novel's final paragraph, Father Yates admits, "I had known everything right from the start and never acted on any of it. I had blocked it from my mind time and again, refusing to recognize what was staring me in the face. I had said nothing when I should have spoken out. People had suffered because of me." The novel incisively demonstrates how Father Yates's inaction is as horrific as Father Cardle's abuse itself. Boyne's novel as a whole demonstrates how it is not enough to recognize sexual abuse. Rather, we must go beyond our consumption of these stories to actively protect children in our own communities from sexual violence. With the advent of the Me Too movement in late 2017, more men are attaching their names to their stories. At the close of the second decade of the 21st century, the stigma of being a male survivor is fading as men reveal their experiences with childhood sexual abuse and its lifelong repercussions. In fiction, the rape novel tells stories of the victim survivors of all genders and concomitantly demands an end to rape culture and a safer world for everyone. In the future, readers will undoubtedly encounter more stories, both fictional and real, of male, female, transgender, and gender fluid victim survivors. By educating readers, shattering stereotypes, and urging empathy for victim survivors, the rape novel demands an end to rape culture and a safer world for everybody. Thank you.